Hi everyone. So in this video, we're going to be looking at what makes an effective thesis statement, which is the Google Doc that you all read for before this class on Wednesday of week 2. And so what we're going to be looking at is not only what a thesis statement is and what it's functioning as within a piece of writing, but we're also looking at what makes a thesis statement strong, what makes it effective for a reader in terms of understanding what the main point of your essay is, right? And so you'll have seen in the Google Doc, which I'll pull up in just a moment, that we never want a thesis statement to just be a factual sentence, unless you're doing report writing, which we're not doing in this class. So in this class, your thesis statement should never be just a factual sentence. For the purposes of our class, we're always going to be writing what I'm calling argumentative thesis statements. What this means is that a reader should be able to disagree with what your thesis statement is saying. Now, to be able to disagree with something does not mean that what your thesis statement says is wrong or weak. What it means is that it's argumentative. It means that you're taking a specific stance or a specific position. You're giving a very specific perspective on a topic that other people may not agree with because it's so specific and it's so subjective in terms of this is your perspective on this topic, right? Your perspective will, of course, be informed. It will be contextual, but it's your perspective. And therefore, someone else should have their own perspective and be able to disagree with yours. Now, I'm going to pull up the effective thesis statements. One moment. If you saw that I was looking at how to record a Zoom video, I wanted to just make sure I was doing it correctly. Okay, so you should have read this document already prior to watching this video. And so we're looking at, again, effective thesis statement and what that means exactly. Now, in order to write a thesis-driven writing that is both thorough, compelling, specific, interesting, we need to make sure your thesis statement is argumentative, informed, contextual, and a guide for your reader. So like I already mentioned, your thesis should never be a factual statement. So I gave an example here. I am 19 years old and have an older sister who I live with. This is an ineffective thesis statement. This is not effective because it does not tell me anything about your perspective on a topic. I can't disagree that you're 19 years old and have a sister who you live with, right? This is just a simple fact. This is not what we're looking for in this class, right? And I said here, factual thesis statements would be okay if you were writing a report, right, about something that happened, but we're not writing reports in this class. And therefore, please never write a factual thesis statement. If you're ever wondering, is my thesis statement factual or argumentative, then take a moment and ask yourself, you know, can someone disagree with this? Read your thesis statement again and consider, could somebody tell me that I'm wrong if they wanted to? If the answer is yes, they could tell you you're wrong, then you've written an argumentative thesis statement. If nobody could in any way or form tell you you're wrong, like I can't tell you you're not 19 years old, then that's a factual thesis statement. And that means you need to go back and revise that to be argumentative. Okay, so like I said, for our class, you will only be writing thesis-driven work that is argumentative and analytical in nature. So therefore, factual thesis statements will not work, and you should not use them. Now, your thesis should answer the question that the prompt is asking you. So for our first essay, I give you 2 options. And each one is going to be focusing on some connection to a single story that you've had told about you or projected onto you and how that affected you, as well as how a balance of stories is important. And so those need to be addressed in your thesis statement, right? So you always need to address the questions in the prompt in your thesis statement. And the suggested outline for each option clarifies which questions from the prompt you should be paying attention to for the thesis, okay? Now, the thesis should move beyond a simple yes or no answer when addressing the question in the prompt, okay? So let's look at an example. If the question in the prompt that a student is writing a thesis-driven argument for is, how does social media impact mental health in your local community? Then an ineffective thesis statement would look something like, social media does impact the mental health of my local community. Or another one would be, social media has an impact on my local community's mental health. So you might be wondering, why are these ineffective? They're answering the question, right? They are providing an answer, and somebody could disagree with it. They could say, I don't think it has an impact on my local community's mental health. Here's why it's ineffective. These two examples are making a claim rather than stating a fact, right? But they're not giving us a reason. Both of these thesis statements are still ineffective because they do not move beyond a simple yes or no answer. So to look again, just by saying social media does impact the mental health of my local community, you are answering the question, but all you're saying is that it exists. You're basically just saying, yes, it does impact my community. This question is asking, how does social media impact mental health in your community, right? And so even though you're addressing the topic, you're not really fully answering the question, okay? There's no reason for why they believe either of these statements and either of those thesis statements, okay? So an effective revision for these thesis statements might look something like this. Social media does impact the mental health of my local community due to the pressures young people feel in securing status, success, or recognition from their peers in online spaces. Okay. Now we both have an answer. The person is acknowledging the topic and providing a point of view. They feel it does impact the mental health of their local community. But now we also have a specific reason, and this is really important. You basically always want to make sure your thesis statement has some type of because in there. So like here they have due to, which is just another way to say because, right? It's connecting your answer to the specific reason. So it's that transitional word in there that you're using, okay? So that's kind of like an outline to keep in mind when making an effective thesis statement is response to the topic, because or transitional word, specific reason, okay? Now, basically make sure that when you utilize because, you are following it with a reason. Don't just restate the answer. So for example, if this person had said, social media does impact the mental health of my local community because the community's mental health has been damaged by social media, right? That's just restating the same thing in different words. Does that make sense? Although I guess that the word damage would imply it's negative, but it's not telling me anything specifically. It's basically just restating that same thing. So do make sure that after you put because or some variation of it to transition to your reason, do make sure that you're giving an actual reason and that it's specific. We don't want vague reasons. We want it to be really concrete, specific things that the reader can look at and say, okay, I understand why they are, making this connection to their argument. Here's the direction they're going to go in for this essay, right? It needs to be absolutely clear to the reader what you're going to be arguing. So if I look at this, okay, the one that we just looked at right here, you can see the highlighting. There, I know which direction this writer is going to go in. I know they're arguing that the impact social media has on mental health is probably negative because young people feel insecure. They may feel pressured to try and be successful in the eyes of others. And I know that they're going to be looking at this idea of recognition from peers and how that's intimidating. Okay, so I know which direction they're going in, and they have been successful in their thesis statement. Now, your thesis should give your readers a sense of where and how you will develop your main claim. So kind of what I just said, but let's look more into that. Some call this a roadmap. For example, one way you might give your readers a sense of how you'll develop your argument is by previewing your main supporting points in the thesis. So that's kind of what I was looking at. Now you can see it color-coded right here, right? Social media does impact the mental health of my local community due to the pressures of young people feeling insecure. And then we have status, success, recognition from peers in online spaces. This is a roadmap. We have 3 different supporting points, right? It lists the different topics that will be discussed in the respective body paragraphs. So as a reader, I know one paragraph will probably focus on status, another will focus on success, and a third will focus on recognition from peers. And the framing for each of those separate topics is all about how people feel pressure in an online space, right? So for example, the first body paragraph will just focus on how people feel pressure to have a certain status in online spaces, specifically like social media, okay? The second paragraph will focus on how young people feel really intimidated, maybe seeing their peers' success and doing a comparison thing, and that makes them feel insecure, and how that takes place in online spaces like social media. The third paragraph would focus on how young people feel like this need to have recognition from their peers to be validated in online spaces, okay? So the reader knows just from the thesis alone that the author will discuss how people feel each of those separate topics, all taking place in an online space. That's the common thread, right? Is that young people feel this pressure in online spaces specifically, but each paragraph focuses on a different thing: status, success, or recognition, okay? But it all has that common thread, and that's what's really holding this thesis together, is that commonality of it taking place in online spaces, and that we know the readers are, or the writer is arguing this leads to a negative impact in their mental health, okay? And like I said here, therefore the reader knows just from the thesis where they're going to go with the essay. And that's really important, because before we dive into your actual support in your body paragraphs, we need to feel comfortable knowing where you're taking us, right? We want to know the direction you're heading in. However, your thesis does not need to be a listing thesis or a roadmap thesis like we just looked at to be considered effective. You know, some teachers don't like listing thesis statements. They say it's too remedial. I don't feel that way. I'm totally fine if you do a listing thesis like the one we just looked at, where you basically answer the prompt, you address the topic, you say because, and then you give your specific reasons in a list of like A, B, and C, which then are your corresponding topics for your body paragraphs. I'm personally fine with that. I think it's really clear. I don't have a problem. I definitely don't find it remedial. I just think it's really clear. But some teachers that you may have in other classes or moving forward in writing classes may prefer you not to do a listing thesis. So let's go over how you can do one that doesn't list the topics, but is still very effective. Now, in the example we're looking at with social media, This author may have also written their thesis as this: social media does impact the mental health of my local community due to the pressures and anxieties young people feel interacting in online spaces. Okay. Now in this version, the author still answers the question and includes a reason for their statement. However, this time they're not just listing each individual topic. They're not doing A, B, and C with the status, success, and recognition, right? Instead, they have given us an umbrella reason. Now, what do I mean by umbrella? I mean, each of those 3 topics that they plan to address are covered under this more broad, yet still specific reasoning in the thesis. Okay, I can still see that they're going to address pressures young people feel in online spaces and how this causes anxiety, right? Because they say so here, pressures and anxiety young people feel in interacting in online spaces. However, they don't list it out the way they did in the first one, yet when they get to the topic sentences where they bring up success, status, and recognition, it will still align with what their thesis says. Okay, it is a little bit more difficult to write a thesis statement with an umbrella reason, but it's important to also feel comfortable being able to write a thesis statement with an umbrella reason. So I would really encourage all of you to practice both. Practice writing out the listing thesis statements, like the first one we looked at, and then practice writing out the umbrella reason statements. And a good practice or exercise for that would be first writing a listing thesis and then looking at that and thinking, what do all 3 of these have in common? So like I mentioned earlier, what is the common thread that's going to hold these 3 reasons together? And then express that specifically, and then that becomes your umbrella reason. Okay? So both are really important. And like I said here, both are perfectly valid and both are effective. You know, different readers have different preferences, of course. I think both work really well. Okay? I'm fine if you do either a listing thesis or an umbrella reason thesis for all 3 of your essays. Do practice both. Do try to become comfortable with doing both. And I encourage you to maybe move outside your comfort zone. If you end up liking one more than the other, try to write the other kind of thesis statement just so you can try out both. Okay? And here's why they're both valid and effective. Sorry about my clock going off. They're both valid and effective because they both A, answer the prompt's question, they're addressing the topic from the prompt, and they're taking a position or a perspective on that topic, right? They both provide a specific reason in some form. So they're either giving us the multiple reasons that they plan to write on in each body paragraph, or they're giving us a more broad thematic reason, but it's still specific, okay? And it will always come after that because or that transitional word. And then lastly, they all clearly show the readers where and how their argument will develop in the rest of their essay. Now, this is really important. The reasoning part of the thesis is where we see the direction the writer will go in, okay? Like I said here, what comes after because is where the reader is going to figure out what direction is this writer heading in, okay? And that, again, can happen in the roadmap form where you're outlining really clearly, here's what each paragraph is going to focus on, right? Or it could be in the thematic umbrella form where you're kind of showing the reader, here's the theme each of my topics are going to tie back to, right? Both work. Both are totally effective. Just try and figure out how you as an author, what you're more comfortable with. I know me personally, I used to prefer the listing thesis, the more I write, now I prefer the umbrella thesis, the one that's more thematic. But that's how I feel as a writer, right? So I urge all of you to practice both throughout the semester and kind of figure out, as an author, what type of thesis do you feel more confident in sharing in your writing, okay? All right, and that's our first mini lesson on effective thesis statements. We'll continue to visit thesis statements throughout the whole semester, of course, because this is obviously integral to all types of writing, especially writing essays. And so we're always going to continue to talk about what makes a strong thesis statement. Okay, revisit this video as often as you need to throughout the semester. And in class, that was my cat jumping on the table. In class, feel free to ask me questions as well about this video or about the Google Doc, and we'll talk about it together. Okay? So I wish you a good rest of your day, and I look forward to seeing you in class.